Welcome to Internet Changemakers, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the Internet's past, present, and future. Join us as we dive into the biggest challenges and opportunities in online trust, privacy, accessibility, and the ever-evolving digital landscape. Whether you're a tech expert or just curious about the Internet's impact on your life, this podcast is your gateway to understanding and shaping a trustworthy, open, and accessible online world. Stay tuned, because the future of the Internet starts with you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Internet Changemakers. In this final episode of the season, we're joined by two powerful voices shaping the Internet's future. Amged Shwehdy is a digital transformation specialist and researcher at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He brings deep insight into Internet governance and policy, with hands-on experience in processes like WSIS Plus 20 and a strong focus on inclusion and local impact. He is also an alumnus of the Early Career Fellowship. Our second guest is Saba Tiku Beyene, who is an AI researcher and youth advocate working at the intersection of ethics, digital rights, and governance. Through her roles at ICANN, the Internet Society, and the UN IGF, she amplifies youth voices and pushes for a more open, fair, and secure Internet. Saba is an alumnus of the Youth Ambassador Program and has just completed the Community Fellowship. Together, we'll explore what the WSIS Plus 20 outcomes really mean, the future of Internet Governance Forum, and where the Internet might be headed next. Thank you for joining us, Amged and Saba.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me, Claire. I'm really excited to join this conversation and to also reflect on the WSIS Plus 20 outcomes, as well as the future of the Internet governance with you.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks to the podcast team for the kind invitation. I'm looking forward to this conversation and catching up with you on the whole process of WSIS and the Internet governance.
That's amazing. Thank you, Saba and Amjad, for joining us today. So I want to start off with a fun question before we get into the really intense conversations about WSIS and the negotiations that happened and what it means for the future of the Internet. But to start off, I want to ask you, let's start with Amjad. What is your first memory of using the Internet? What do you remember? How did you first interact with Internet?
Yeah, my first time using the Internet was around 2000. It's like long before social media. It was an era of forums, mailing lists, and early websites. We didn't care about the UI back then. So it was more onto the access to the Internet. I remember using it to search, learn, and simply for things that are not available locally. And it helped me to connect with my peers, and the Scouts movement is like regional and sub-regional. So it felt more of like a window to the world, It's like, I believe this sense of that geography matter less. It's what inspired me to do what I'm doing now on Internet governance. It's like how we all were connected through this network.
That's awesome. I also remember those early days where, you had these forums that you logged into, and now that you go back and look at it, it looks so archaic. But back then, that was your interface to the rest of the world. Saba, what about you? What was your first interface with the Internet?
My first memory of using the Internet was mostly for school as well as for curiosity. I still remember going to internet cafes while I was at high school and searching things on Google, creating my first email account, as well as using social medias like Facebook, in order to connect with people beyond my environment. And at that moment in time, it's like the most magical thing, because suddenly the world was much bigger than my city. But growing up and over time, I realized that the Internet is not just about entertainment or communication, but it's also about opportunities, access to information, and also having a voice as well. So that personal experience is what later shaped my interest within the Internet governance, because I saw how powerful access can be and also how unequal it is still for many communities.
Thank you so much for that answer, Saba. And you mentioned the importance of community and how that is one of the things that makes the internet governance world possible, is that we all want to be a voice for the internet. And that is a perfect segue into what we are here to talk about today, which is the WSIS Plus 20 outcomes. So I'm going to pass this to Amged. You were on the ground in New York at the UN when this happened. Can you please give our listeners a little bit of background context into what is WSIS and why it matters?
So the WSIS, is the World Summit of Information Society. The first edition was in the result of the increased interest of, or let's say, the emerging technologies back in the 2000s. It was like the internet, how it's like starting shaping our daily life, with the digitization and digitalization. So I believe there was like the sense of like many countries or globally like excluded. So there was like the need of building a process that ensures that everyone can be connected or can be part of this new era. So it was like a matter of building the process and coordinating to ensure that people get more into be connected easily. Started in Tunisia in 2005. The first meeting, then we had the WSIS review after 10 years, and now we had the second review of the WSIS mandate, where it's like, the General Assembly of United Nations comes and come up with a resolution and decisions of how the member states, the majority of the globe want to tackle these issues. So if I may say that the WSIS, the first edition was on the exclusion. This review is like still acknowledges the exclusion globally, but adds more, acknowledges the complexity that is happening when it comes to data, to AI, the platforms, the sovereignty. So it's like, it's complex. And it's like, we can say it's like WSIS on steroid, it's like a new addition to tackle all current issues and emerging ones.
Thank you. So you mentioned that it started in 2005, and that is back in, the internet cafe era of the internet. So much has happened since 2005. So when they came to meet in New York 20 years later, what were they trying to do? What was their goal?
So, the resolution of this WSIS review last 20 is like, it's neither revolution or it's like a copy paste of the current exercises. It's like more of like a course of correction, if I may say. So it's like the same principles that we are familiar with, multi-stakeholderism, human rights, digital inclusions are still there. I believe it's not accidental, those principles held over the last 20 years. But the main outcomes, let's say, here was the institutionalization of the process. It's like tightening the institutional process, from the IGF becoming a permanent, Internet Governance Forum, having a clearer follow-ups and reportings through the IGF to WSIS, then the process within the UN system, and explicitly link the whole process from the GDC, the Global Digital Compact, to the AI governance and other data governance processes within the UN system. So it's like building the whole ecosystem, or let's say shaping the bigger image. This is what this WSIS brought, the review plus 20.
Thanks, Amjad. So taking cue from what Amjad said, Saba, I want to ask you, the WSIS plus 20 outcomes, they are an extension of what the kind of values and principles that were already embedded in the internet governance ecosystem, and they have been extended. So all of this sounds promising, but what is needed to make sure that it delivers on the promise of the internet going into the future? And I also want to touch upon IGF becoming a permanent institution now, since you were a multi-stakeholder advisory group member in 2023. How do you see this particular change, and what should we now expect going forward now that IGF is a permanent institution?
So the WSIS plus 20 outcomes are very important because some of the key principles like digital inclusion, human rights online, multi-stakeholder governance, the role of digital technologies in development, and so on. They also recognize the growing importance of emerging technologies, and here especially AI. But the challenge is that many of these commitments are not actually new. because we have been talking about bridging the digital divide and using technologies for development for almost 20 years, for the last 20 years. So now the real question is whether we will finally move from commitments to implementation. And what needs to happen next is that these global outcomes, they must be translated into a national as well as into regional actions. And here governments should align the outcomes, the WSIS plus 20 outcomes within their national digital strategies, within their AI policy, data protection frameworks, as well as their digital related development plans. Otherwise, the outcomes going to remain documents discussed in forums without a real impact on our lives. And another key step that I believe is strengthening the role of regional as well as national IGFs. And here, with the IGF becoming permanent, there is now an opportunity to make it a stronger bridge between global policy discussions and local realities. And of course, the IGF ecosystem is the best place for sharing best practices as well as building capacity. So we need to promote this even more and support countries in implementing the WSIS vision in a more practical way. So coming to your last point, Yug, with the IGF becoming permanent, and I think the biggest change is that IGF can now be seen as a continuous space for dealing with the real problems that the internet is facing today. The internet is now connected to everything like security, AI, elections, human rights, and so on. And these issues do not disappear after one discussion. So having the IGF permanent means that we can keep this important conversation going and followed up through ongoing work streams. So permanent status means consistent focus on how this conversation actually involve. And second is, as the digital economy is evolving, I think the IGF can also play a really important role in bridging diverse perspectives together, because right now we see a lot of things between what countries are doing at the national level and also the need for some kind of global coordination and collaboration. And here, take AI governance, for example. Some countries are moving fast with their own national plans, and that's really creating different approaches around the world. And a permanent IGFs gives us space to talk through these differences and try to balance innovation along with some of the human-centered principles across these different contexts. And lastly, IGF can also help to make these ongoing conversations about emerging technologies, as well as other key as well as important issues in a more stable as well as in a more continuous way, and can be one of the few spaces where these topics are discussed openly and also discussed in a multi-stakeholder way. So the real transformation is that the IGF becoming an ongoing ecosystem for learning, as well as for keeping ourselves accountable on such themes like cybersecurity, digital economy, AI, and so on.
Saba, I completely agree with you. I think now that IGF is a permanent feature, it will give a renewed boost to national and regional IGFs, which, they don't always have the structures to persist, and they rely upon IGF secretariat or the gathering at IGF itself to sustain. But now I think that we'll see more people participate and participate more actively now that they know that this is going to be a permanent feature. Amjad, I want to go back to the WSIS plus 20 review process that really picked up pace in 2025 and talk about some of the access issues that different stakeholders may have faced in participating in the process. So primarily it is a multilateral process, but you have the multi-stakeholder model of the internet so intertwined with this process. Still, there were concerns that were voiced that, civil society members are not having enough access to influence the decisions that are being made. So how did that transparency evolve? And do you think that the stakeholders were satisfied at the end that their voice was heard?
Thank you. Yeah, satisfaction depends on where you stood. So many governments were celebrating that night is like because they achieved what they wanted. But for the non-state actors, especially civil society from the global south, the process felt structurally constrained. It was a multilateral first, multi-stakeholder second. So everything happened between in a closed doors and the government levels, but then the multi-stakeholder engagement happened. So transparency in general existed. There were some concerns, by the member states and the General Assembly is like saying like, the process wasn't transparent enough. But it existed. Documents were public, consultation happened, but influence was uneven. Those governments with the permanent missions in New York, good travel budgets, legal teams, big legal teams, had the advantage where the less fortunate countries or, governments from the global south had less resources or fewer resources to play a bigger role in the conversation. However, many organizations, it's like global organizations work together with member states, let's say from Africa. We have the Economic Commission for Africa. They did a very good job in the last year, during the review process to incorporate and bring the African voices into the conversation. On the other side, we have the civil society. The civil society tried to adapt through coordinating statements. ISOC did a great job in creating the venue for the global civil society members and those, other civil societies to join. Informal briefings, the strategic engagements around the IGF, and the global IGF. We had the other WASES review sessions, and the sub-regional and regional IGFs. So it wasn't an easy thing, I believe, for the civil society, especially those from the global south. And nowadays, with the whole process, with the visa restrictions and etc. So, even being in New York in person to be part of these discussions is getting harder and expensive. So the door was open, but not everyone reached it at the same time. If I can summarize the whole satisfaction and transparency question.
That's such an interesting side of it that I hadn't even thought about. Of course, there are constraints in terms of getting access to the discussions and getting access to the decision-making table, but the structural barriers and even getting to participate, getting the visa, the flight, even accommodation in New York City is eye-watering. It's so interesting to think about how many people would have really greatly benefited from these conversations but didn't have the resources to attend. And what's really sad about that is the internet is weaker for it. The more we're able to bring people of diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives, and diverse opinions from both the global north and the global south to the table, that is actually how we create the best policy for everyone. So thank you so much for highlighting those structural barriers to access this kind of forum. What does this look like and where do we go from here? What would you say are really the biggest risks that we're looking at right now?
So risks when it comes to the implementation of WASES outcomes are considerably big because, these outcomes are the matter of the governments to adapt, as Saba said. So you need each government, based on their priority, local priority, needs to adapt these outcomes and integrate them in their strategies when it comes to internet in general, AI, other emerging technologies. But it also helps the UN system, because this priority goes within the different entities, like working on technology. We have the UNDP is doing a great job on this, UNESCO, other international organizations. We are trying to adapt with these outcomes and build their strategy based on these outcomes, as it's like represents the global majority and it's like a General Assembly resolution. So this is the risk when it comes to the implementation of the WASES review plus 20 outcomes.
I gather from that there's a need for harmonization of the regulations that will be developed and integrated in national policy spaces. Could IGF then be this place where countries come together and try to harmonize this? Or do you think that the countries will continue to discuss this in multilateral forums or just, decide to go their own way and not really consult or coordinate with other governments? How do you see this going forward?
Yeah, I believe the IGF plays an amazing role in this, as it creates the venue to all stakeholders, from government and other stakeholders to come and discuss with no commitments. And I believe many people sees that the IGF doesn't come with a strong outcomes, it's like committed outcomes. But I believe that's the added value of the IGF, where it's like a venue. People, stakeholders come, discuss the emerging issues, and learn about different things that helps and feeds in the future process to coordinate internally. We need to work on both ways, having the multi-stakeholderism approach in a regional level, but also work on the multilateral approach between, especially in the regions. We have the African Union is doing some work on harmonizing the regulations when it comes to data flow, data protection, cybersecurity, and other things. I believe we have the European Union did some success before when it comes to the GDPR, the AI Act, and other regulations. So having such harmonized regulation in a regional level, it helps. It helps in saving the internet, and also pave the way to economic growth, more connectivity, saving the network as is, the internet as is. Yeah.
You kind of talked a little bit about what I was going to ask you, but we're facing a lot of risks here, and the WSIS outcome is helpful towards steering the car in the right direction, but we also know that there's going to be a lot of bumps in the road. What keeps you optimistic?
It's hard to be optimistic nowadays with everything's going on, but I believe the idea or the hope is in the multi-stakeholderism, that still works. We saw it in the IGFs, we saw it and even with the review. So multi-stakeholderism maybe not perfect, but it's better than any other alternatives. We look at the IGF, the ICANN, the NRIs, they have created the venue for small countries, civil society, youth to engage and not just react to what's going on. And importantly, we are seeing more countries from Africa again and the global south, shaping the agenda. So it's not just attending the meetings. I would love to celebrate one thing, I saw in WACE's meeting and in New York, there was the first Nigerian or African delegation from Nigeria that represents the whole stakeholders. So we saw the youth in that delegation, the civil societies, the private sector, and people from academia and the government. They were in one delegation coming and advocating for their agenda. And this is what we would love to see in all other countries, this level of coordination. And I believe this model of the multi-stakeholderism survived and survives only if we protect its openness, its accountability. Once the participation becomes symbolic, legitimacy collapses. So it's we need to engage. Some people say multi-stakeholderism is weak, it's slow, but it is effective and it's way sustainable.
Thank you, Amged. And I'll throw the same question to Saba. So we've come a long way since the first WSIS forum, and we're going to come a long way in the next 20 years. It won't all be easy, but it will all be important. What keeps you optimistic?
I do support what Amged says a lot, but specifically what gives me hope is there is a growing awareness as well as engagement of young people, as well as engagement of civil society stakeholders within this space. And we are looking at different youth-led initiatives coming and being part of the global discussion, and also starting from the local ground, right? And multi-stakeholder initiatives that also Amged said, ICANN, IGF, they really show collaboration is possible. And meaningful outcomes can also be produced across these discussions. And in my region, we see there is an increasing participation in national, regional, local youth IGFs and IGFs as well, which really can tell you that people care deeply about the future of the internet. They really care about the connectivity issues. They really care about cybersecurity. They deeply care about their online safety when they are using the internet. And also coming into, I've also said about how encouraging it is. The multi-stakeholder platforms like IGFs are also creating rooms, especially for young people, to have a conversation. Because I was part of the AI Action Summit in Paris that took place last year in 2025, almost this time in February, where there was a use declaration outcome as an outcome from the discussion we had with all the use IGF coordinators. And here they try to really put out in a document where they all talk about their experience regarding AI and also what governments should do, what all stakeholders should do in order to see that AI really can benefit a generation, not really risk them. And of course, the real risks are there, but generally what keeps me hopeful is that there is a growing awareness, there is a growing collaboration. As I said, there is a local leadership that is still pushing for emerging tech, for AI, as well as the internet to serve the community, to serve development as a general.
Thank you, Saba. So now I have a question for both of you as we're trying to, look at the future and say what's on the horizon of the internet. Starting with you, Amged, is there any new technology or internet-related project or initiative that you're working on right now that really excites you?
Oh, yeah, everything is evolving, I believe, right? We have the AI and everything, but honestly, I'm excited by how the digital public infrastructure is evolving, the concept of the DPI, especially when it's open, interoperable, and rights respecting. I believe when governments build shared digital rails properly, innovation becomes cheaper, faster, and more inclusive. And as back again to the buzzwords like the AI. So I believe yani watching how AI is capacity building is finally entering the development conversation. So how can we utilize this for our daily lives and is interesting. So it's not only the regulations aspect, but also the access, how to ensure everyone has a connection, know how to use the AI and in an unbiased way. Yeah, that's what is exciting me right now.
Thank you. And I agree. DPI, digital public infrastructure, is really interesting. And the way that it can support communities is something that I'm so happy people are researching and learning more about because it could be a real game changer. So, Saba, what about you? What are you working on right now? What is coming across your desk that gets you excited for the future of the internet?
Thank you very much, Claire, again. I mean, what really excites me nowadays is that there is a growing movement around AI for development, around locally driven innovation, and I do share what Amged also shared. But mine is specifically around open source AI because I really think it's powerful as it makes innovation more transparent, to be more accessible, because it allows local communities and as well as researchers, innovators, specifically those from the global south, to build solutions like AI solutions based on their own data, based on their own language, as well as that's the local priority. And this also eventually shifts us from being users of tech to becoming our own creators. And this is especially very important for those of us living in the African continent and from the global south. And here, a great example is the Masakane. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's a Pan-African research community working on open source natural language processing for African language, where they develop and share models for translation, as well as technologies in language that are more often ignored within the global AI systems. This is very important because language inclusion is a general form of digital inclusion. Apart from this, I'm now working on also a project which is I'm so passionate about, and that is I work within the GIZ Africa Union office professionally and working on AI Made in Africa project. And the core objective is to strengthening the conditions that are needed for an effective AI use when it comes to Africa's digital economy. And here we mainly focus on the private sector. First, development of policy papers, especially when we try to analyze the current trends, identifying policy gaps, and also provide practical recommendation in order to help shape policies at the national, at the regional, also at the continental level. And we also work on a surveying of African AI businesses, this is specifically aimed at to map or to identify who is working in the AI space. This is the startup specifically or the AI businesses across Africa, and later understanding the challenges as well as identifying their opportunities for growth as well as for collaboration. It can be with investors and so on later. And another important work that we are doing is data accessibility, which is specifically for the African innovation ecosystem. And this is exploring how high quality as well as context relevant data sets, how they can be more available to the startup ecosystem, to the AI business ecosystem, so that those innovators can really access those openly accessible data sets in order to build their AI solution. And currently, the research shows that there are around more than 220 open datasets available for the African AI ecosystem. Of course, this is really exciting. Last but not least, we also, as part of the project, contribute to AI policy dialogues at national, at continental, as well as at the regional level in order to bringing the findings from all this work and later to inform evidence-based discussions that's really going to strengthen the Africa's digital ecosystem.
Thanks, Saba, for sharing that. I think AI is obviously such an important technology, and a lot of innovation happens in local spaces where people look at their local challenges and see that the big companies are not really filling that niche or not really solving those problems. And then through their own ingenuity and creativity, they try to pick these data sets that you are helping them have access to and build their own technologies to solve those local problems. So encouraging startups, encouraging the youth who are working on these technologies is such an important thing to be doing right now. So I applaud you on the work that you and your team are doing. So I think I also want to touch upon the question of youth and the role that they play in sort of extracting the potential out of these emerging technologies, but also in general in strengthening the internet and making sure that the challenges that we're facing today are dealt with. So what is your view on, I'll pass this on to Amjad. What is your view on the role of youth in shaping the future of the internet? And as we also discussed during our conversation on WSIS, a lot of times participation is seen as tokenism. And this is especially true in the case of youth. So how do you think that needs to be dealt with, changed, so that we can meaningfully include youth in some of these conversations?
Yes, the idea of the issue of tokenisms always raises us, like when it comes to the youth participation and how engaged they are in the conversation. So I believe it becomes tokenized when it's symbolic, it's like rather it's like resources. So it's easily to bring youth for panels, but it's like influence is harder to ensure that they have part of the discussion as like the decision making. I believe meaningful engagement requires early involvement in the agenda settings. We have the capacity building that goes beyond the workshops with online webinars. And again, it's like needs to be structured. It's like we need to have pathways from youth spaces to the decision-making bodies. So it's not only the talk, we need to walk that talk. So if youth only speaks after the decision are made, that's not participation, it's only decoration. And I believe we have some good examples of meaningful youth participation we should acknowledge. We have the programs like the Isaac Internet Ambassadors and the ICANN NextGen. So both of them are genuine work. I believe some of the editorial team here like been part of these programs. I have seen those young participants in major global meetings asking or tackling the unspoken areas, like the ones that others avoid, raising issues that really matter. And I believe what makes these programs successful is that they don't just invite you to observe, but equip them with the tools to intervene. But the only problem here is the scale. So we need more programs like this across regions, again, languages, and shouldn't be only in English and more into the policy spaces. So we can ensure that those youth perspectives is there in the discussion. Yeah.
Thanks, Amjad. Saba, I want to bring you in on this as well. As Amjad was saying, that there are some opportunities for youth, but it's not always clear on how to make this engagement long term, how to build pathways that take them into some kind of a specialization so that they can continue contributing to the growth of the internet and development of the internet. What has your experience been like? You have been part of some of these programs and fellowships. You also championed the cause of the youth when you were a MAD member. So how do you think we can build those pathways to make sure that the engagement with youth is not just at surface level, but it's sustainable and substantive?
Yeah, so youth organization specifically, they really rely on volunteer work as well as short-term funding, which can really make it or the sustainability part very difficult because passion alone, they cannot sustain long-term engagement, I believe. So one important solution is to have a support, which is an institutional support. This means creating paid opportunities, having long-term programs, also having a stable funding mechanism to youth-led initiatives in order to motivate them to work better and work more. Another key element, I believe, in intergenerational collaboration, and of course, the mentorship part, I will come back to it later. Young people partnering or working with policymakers and mentorships, shared leadership of like transferring knowledge, to identify what's missing, how to level up in their career, how to fill that gap. As I think this eventually help to build trust between those generations. And we need to ensure that youth participation is meaningful because Amgad was saying about the meaningful part earlier. This is because many times we hear youth participation, but we have to ask, is it really meaningful? Because young people should be involved in those agenda setting from the start, in policy drafting, in decision-making processes, not only just a one-time attendee or just an observer of that gathering or that meeting, because this will later help to strengthening the legitimacy as well as the effectiveness of the digital governance process. So I would really say, well, from the past involvements that I had within the MAG, especially the working group on youth engagement, the mentorship program, I really say that it's a collective responsibility of all stakeholder groups can be within the MAG, within the IGF, and also within the digital spaces to make sure that young people are included in such spaces and to make this the whole reality, because this would later add into our digital future.
That's amazing, Saba. I completely agree with you. It's really important to focus on youth as a stakeholder and make sure that we engage them and bring them into the decision-making processes, because it is ultimately they will be executing the vision that we are discussing right now in 5, 10, 20 years. So it's important to get them involved right now, build the capacities, build the skills that they need to meaningfully participate, and just strengthen that intergenerational collaboration as well, as you mentioned. So I think as we come towards the end of this episode, Saba, what would be a message that you would like to give to people who are listening to this podcast on how they can contribute to strengthening the internet? What would be your call to action for them?
All right. So my message to the listeners is that the future, our future, and especially the future of the internet is not something that to be decided only by tech companies or tech enthusiasts or government by itself. We need to shape it as everyday users. And as we move into 2026 and beyond, everybody can contribute by engaging in their local as well as regional digital governance spaces or IGF spaces, learning more about emerging tech, about AI. And we should really see the internet as well as a shared public that really requires all our collective responsibility. So if we really want a safe and open as well as an inclusive internet, we have to start to actively participate in building it moving forward.
Amjad, what would be your parting message to the people listening?
Oh, yeah. Don't wait for the global process to fix the internet. Engage locally. Join the NRIs, national regional initiatives related to the IGF. Support digital rights group. Question the policies that limits access, freedom, and push for inclusion. The internet stays open only if people actively defend it. Governance is not a spectator or sport. And I believe the future of internet shaped by those who show up. So if you are into the place and the venue, raising your voice, you will be part of this. Otherwise, you will be affected only.
That's right. It's time to tie up the shoelaces and start running towards this goal. Thank you so much, Saba and Amjad, for joining us for this conversation today. It was really amazing talking to you and for sharing your insights and experiences. And I'm sure the messages that you left our listeners with will resonate. And I'm sure that we'll see more people joining hands to making sure that internet is safe and secure and accessible to everyone.
Thank you, Yog and Claire, for this episode. Thank you, Saba, for your inputs too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugh and Claire, for having me on this episode. It has been a pleasure to share my thoughts, and thanks again.
And that is a season wrap. What an incredible first season this was. We discussed everything from the history of the internet to how to connect to it. We learned why our internet costs what it does, and importantly, the costs of not being connected. We had deep conversations with experts about how the internet is governed through multi-stakeholderism and how users, young and old, benefit from this technology. Listeners from over 50 countries heard us loud and clear when we said the internet is for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Thank you to my co-hosts, Yug and Noha, and our alumni team of producers, Kim, Alan, and Abdul Rahman, who bring this podcast to life. To support our work of keeping the internet open, globally accessible, safe, and trustworthy, consider donating through the link in the show notes or by building your own capacities at internetsociety.org/learning.